Amazing Tarot friends, Justin Michael. Welcome back to my channel. And of course, welcome if it's your first time visiting. I appreciate you stopping by as always. So in this video, it's a third installment of a historic card maker series that I'm doing. And I initially planned to talk about Leon, which I will touch on a bit in this video. But I decided to actually push that discussion out to next Monday, where I'm going to sit down with Marco Benedetti, who's very knowledgeable about card making, and we're going to have a chat about Leon, the influence of Leon early on in France. We're going to talk about the Nicolas Rollicon, which is like a kind of controversial deck a bit because there's a lot of shady details and a lot of unknowns with the date and so forth. So we're going to have a discussion on that Monday, a week from today. So Monday 4 p.m. Next week. So I wanted to make a video sort of in preparation for that discussion, but also I want to address the topic of the the broader topic of Tarot De Marseille. What is it? What do we mean by Tarot De Marseille? And why do we call it Tarot De Marseille? Most of the information I'm going to be using in this video is based on something by Thierry Depaulis. He's a historian. It's an essay called Tarot De Marseille, Facts and Fallacies. It's broken up into two parts. I'm going to link that below. I highly suggest you read that if you're interested in this, because there's so much information that he presents in that. It's the best thing that I've read on this topic, hands down. It's what I've been searching for a really long time, and it really put a lot of the pieces together and helped me understand, what Tarot De Marseille is. So we hear the term a lot. We're like, and I've recently seen some videos on like what is Tarot De Marseille. So I kind of wanted to address that. So what we say, what we mean when we say Tarot De Marseille is the standard pattern that emerged out of France, particularly in the region of Marseille later on in the 18th century, but actually did not originate there. And it was more, in fact, Marseille was very late to the game. And so let me just, before we get into the two, there are two types of this standard pattern, and I'm going to show you what those two types are. But I just want to give you a brief kind of outline of how tarot unfolded in France as far as we know. So in the early 1500s, the first decade of 1500, tarot starts to catch on in France. The earliest deck we have is actually, it doesn't mean it's the first deck, but the earliest we have is a deck called it's by Caitlin Joffrey. And it's not a Tarot De Marseille type. It's not the standard pattern that we see with Tarot De Marseille. In fact, the pips are not even like the Italian suited pips. They are like birds and monkeys and things like that. But it's a very kind of interesting deck. And this is just a couple of cards. This is from 1557. It was printed in Leon, which is one of the cities I'm going to talk about. This, like I said, it's not the standard Tarot De Marseille type. It's more like the Tarot of Paris and fits in that mold. What I found interesting, really, from this deck was that it's from Leon, which is interesting, but also the Hangman so this is from the Francois Gasman, and the Hangman is basically identical. The Gasman wasn't made until about 1840, and so this is from 1557. So I don't know if anybody knows about the Hangman and the Gasman and its relation to Joffrey. Was it because there was a bigger tradition where this Hangman existed, and then so Gasman got it from there, or what was he, paying tribute to the Caitlin Joffrey deck? I just don't know, but I found that very, very interesting. But this is the earliest that we have. So we know the tarot was around in France in the 1550s, and before that, but we just don't have any surviving copies. So in the 1580s, it starts to get taxed and regulated. And then with the taxation, we have a lot of records, and we're able to really see like the story of card making in France. So 1583, they started taxing, playing cards. So taxes on tarot was double of that on regular playing cards. And I talked about that previously. By 1605, it was, I believe, Henri III had limited playing card production, which includes tarot and regular playing cards, limited to 7 cities in France. And this is in 1609. Okay, Marseille was not one of them. Leon and Rouen were the top two. But in terms of very early tarot, Leon, and then one that's not marked on here is Avignon, is another candidate that was like printing really, really early tarot. Rouen isn't even really included in that until a little bit later. But they're really influential, and ultimately Leon and Rouen compete against each other. And with this kind of limiting, production to 7 cities, they also hammered them with taxes. And both Rouen and Leon complained. And they both managed, I think in like 1609, like just after, they managed to overturn the taxes. So they both cities. Leon was complaining about other cities ripping them off, and there was this entitlement that Leon had that you don't see in other cities. And then in 1623, the taxes come back on Rouen and Leon and everyone else, but Leon is the only one that manages to avoid paying taxes. So they had this kind of favor of the French kingdom. They didn't have to pay taxes after that. They had a lot of influence. Part of the reason is because they proposed that they become the chief exporter, and they supply all of France, Italy, Spain, and Flanders. We know that Leon was exporting cards to places like Rome and Spain. We have all kinds of documents. They were exporting everywhere, as well as all of France. Tarot in Marseille at this period was popular, but they were more than likely importing it from Leon. And there's a lot of reasons for why Leon was probably favored. And I was asking some friends who were, researchers and things, and someone suggested it was geography. Their close proximity to Switzerland and Italy and everything. But I think it's also because they were really well established and their cards were really, really nice. And there's some, documents that talk about the quality of the cards from Leon, and various other historic documents that are just really very interesting. So Leon was like, basically the main candidate, was the star of the show at this point. Now in 1631, the playing card production actually opens up nationwide, and they start adding cities. That's when Marseille was permitted to print. Before that, before 1631, Leon was actually complaining, and they named Marseille by name, actually, and Dijon, and they said that the card makers there were ripping them off. This was likely an exaggeration early on, but then later on, so 1631, Marseille is now permitted to print cards. And now keep in mind that all these, so the blue markers on here are before 1631. These are the early ones, and the red ones are the ones that are added. Not all of the blue markers actually printed tarot. Some of them just printed playing cards, like Limoges and Toulouse and places like that. The only place that we really know tarot came from of these early places is Paris, Rouen, and Leon. Avignon was definitely printing tarot, and they were printing playing cards very early on, but then they stopped. But Avignon was a papal state. It wasn't a part of the French kingdom. There was a papacy there, and there's a whole big history with that. But then now, so in 1642, after Marseille starts to print cards, 1642, Leon, the card makers there, again complain they're being ripped off. People are stealing their images. And that's right around the time of like the Noble too. And it kind of gives me an idea, and this is just my opinion, but when we look at the Jean Noble, how different it is from this. It's technically what we call type 1, and I'm going to expand on that in a minute, but it's somewhat different. It's very unique to the Jean Noble. And probably the reason for that is possibly because of the complaints, that were being lodged by Leon being ripped off. You know what I mean? Now, when you look at Marseille, when you look at the early card makers in Marseille, they're all imported from various regions, especially, Rouen and Leon. And all of their early designs were based on Leon. And so that's what I wanted to make the point that when we say Tarot de Marseille, we're talking about a very specific pattern that emerged. It wasn't the first pattern. There were other patterns that came out of France. But it's the most dominant, and it becomes, by the 18th century, Marseille becomes this major producer of the Tarot, and then we have more examples from Marseille than anywhere else. But they were late to the game, is what I'm saying. And so Tarot de Marseille is kind of a misnomer, because the Tarot did not originate in Marseille. It may not have originated in Lyon either, but it's very possible that the Trumps did originate there. It's very possible, in my mind. We know that the pips came from Italy, but it's very, very possible, in my opinion, that somewhere in France, probably Lyon, the Tarot de Marseille was developed. And I think that Tarot de Lyon would be a better title to Tarot de Marseille. But, you know, it's just kind of like the Charles VI deck, too. It's like we call it the Charles VI deck, but we found out later Charles VI had nothing to do with the Charles VI deck, but yet we still call it the Charles VI. It's like that kind of thing. So it's a misnomer. And Thierry Depaulis, he talks all about that in his essay. He talks about all the early card makers in Marseille. He talks about you know, a lot of cool stuff, some fragments that were found. So what Thierry argues is that there are two types, and this is, like I said, only important in understanding the early development of tarot in France. That's type 1 and type 2. So this is the Jean Dodal, which is probably the most well-known of the Lyon decks. You know, it's the most popular, at least currently. We have the Nicolas Rollicon, which is, I'm not going to get too much into because we're going to talk about that next week, but there's some kind of shady details involved with the Rollicon. Like, we don't have a solid copy of the deck. And, you know, we only have a drawing of it that was in a publication about card making in La Mensual or whatever. I can't remember the name of the publication, but we don't have the actual deck. We have record that deck existed, and it's supposed to be a complete deck. So this is the Dodal made by Fleur Noir. So it's not an exact, like, you know, facsimile, but in the same sense, it's good enough. It's a very well-respected deck, and everybody knows it. It was my first Dodal. So, and then this is the Nicolas Convert, which didn't come about until 1760, way later, you know. And so Marseille, you know, at that time in 1760, this is the type 2. So that's the Convert represents the type 2. That's the dominant. After 1750, like, it becomes dominant. So type 1 is what Thierry Depaulis argues is what tarot looked like very early on when it was being printed in, you know, Lyon. And he believes that, you know, because we have some records that date back to the Spanish Inquisition that name French cards in Lyon, and they describe the world card, and there's, you know, various fragments that we have that date back to the 1680s, and there's some cards that were found in a well in Castelletto's Forzeca, which was a you know, I think in Italy they found those, I believe Milan, and so French cards were being likely imported to Milan. His main point is that Tarot de Marseille is a misnomer. It didn't originate in Marseille, and there are two types. And the reason we call Tarot de Marseille is because Marseille had the most surviving decks, and they became really popular in the 18th century, but that's not where it was born. You know, it was born in Lyon. And, you know, the type 1 pattern was, you know, older. And so this is, like I said, this is the type 1, this is the type 2. And so I'm going to point them out as we go. And so, you know, you can see, so, and Thierry makes this point too, is like type 2 is a modernization of type 1. It's, you know what I mean? It's an improvement. And there are early decks, even in Marseille, that were printed that are of type 1. And, you know, they later changed to type 2. So it's mostly this, I mean, aside from the general aesthetic, like, you know, the details and everything, like, you can look at these two cards, you can see, like, they're the same thing, but they're just drawn differently. So the first marker of type 1 and 2 is the Emperor, and that's the number 4 on the Emperor. And so Thierry Depaulis is the person who came up with the term type 1 and type 2. and that's why this is very interesting. So he is the person to read with respect to type 1 and type 2, and so that's why I'm using his information. I know that Stuart Kaplan mentioned it before, and also some various other people, but you know, I believe he expanded on what Kaplan said in Kaplan's book in like the 80s. But so this is the first marker. This is you know, the Emperor, and it has the number 4. Okay, so the second thing is the Hierophant, and you have the Papal Crozier versus the Papal Cross. So that's marker number 2. This is a rather obvious one. You have the Angel, which is flying from the right in type 1, going towards the left, and then in type 2 it's the opposite. But if you look at the angels, you can just see, you know, this angel is much more polished, it's more defined, it's kind of fancier in a way, whereas this is more of like a caricature, you know what I mean? But as like a crash helmet, you know, it's an interesting character. But so this is what theory is saying, is that, you know, type 1 was original, and then type 2 is what it was altered into later. The Chariot, you have the canopy. In type 1, you have that kind of curly canopy, whereas in type 2, you have like a theatrical curtain, is what it looks like. But relatively, you know, the same symbolism everywhere else. You have the wings in Justice, you know, or what look like wings. That could be a chair back, in my opinion, but and then you have, you know, just a regular chair back. But you just look at the face; it's more defined. It's supposed to have been more attractive and more appealing. And although I really love type 1, it's one of my favorites. All the type 1s, especially the Dodal. The Hermit isn't one, and neither is the Wheel. The writing on the Strength card, you know, is just that's for sale to foreigners. It's a stamp that they put for tax reasons. It doesn't really mean anything in terms of the design. Okay, so now the Hangman. We have the Hangman here, and theory does not mention this in, you know, type 1, type 2 characteristics. But it's a big one for me, because you have the hands here poking out, and then you have the tongue coming out, and then in this one, you know, his hands are behind his back, and it's just rather obvious, but it's not officially a thing, you know, a characteristic. Okay, Death is the same, so is Temperance. The Devil is another big one, and it's rather obvious, you know, big wings in the type 1 Devil, and you have the face and the belly, whereas no face, smaller wings in the type 2. The Tower, you have the flame shooting out of the tower towards the sun, and then in type 2, it's the reverse, coming from the sun into the tower. And that's one of the markers. The Star doesn't have any. Okay, the Moon, this is like, I think this is an important card for multiple reasons. Number one, okay, so this is type 1, it has the full face of the moon. And then type 2 has a profile. But when you look at the carry sheet, okay, so I showed this on my channel before, but this is the carry sheet, and this is dated to, by Michael Dummett, dates it to Milan in the 1500s, around 1500. There are people like Ross Caldwell, who I've spoken to, who told me that, you know, that wasn't really a solid conclusion by Dummett. That it's just basically a circular reasoning is what he said that Dummett used, based on the you know, the orders of the cards. But there are a lot of people, and I believe Ross is among this group, that believe this carry sheet could be from Milan, but could also be from France. It could be either from Avignon, or it could be from, which is the Papal States, so not technically France, or it could be from Leon. And this is what if you look at this, I mean, you see the influence of Tarot de Marseille. This is very early, but if you look at the moon, it's a type 1 type moon. You know, it's a full face, and you're missing the animals here, but in the same sense, it's very, very type 1. That was my point. But another thing he says is, too, Ross pointed out to me, was that the Pope is just a bishop. It's not actually a Pope in this. And so, you know, it could have been Avignon because they had a, that's where the Pope was, and there was a dispute over the papacy and so forth, and which I don't know too much about, but someone had mentioned that, and I thought that was pretty cool, But theory says that this could be an earlier pattern. It could have been earlier. It could be an earlier stage of type 1. You know what I mean? Before they added numbers and so forth, it was just kind of like a natural evolution. And you can see the chariot there, and it's just very interesting. But anyway, so we have the moon there. The sun is not included in that, and neither is judgment. Okay, and the world is really, really an important one. So, what is suggested in the essay that I mentioned was that, the type 2 world is like more appealing. It's sexier. It's a partially nude figure, a dancing woman, whereas in the type 1 it's an androgynous figure. It's sort of strange looking, although I find it very charming. But this card is also mentioned, in records in the Spanish Inquisition. It's described, the 4 evangelists are described, and that design, this world card design, which is the type 1 image, exists also in the Noble. Even though the Noble is slightly different, it has relatively the very similar world card. You know what I mean? It was only known in French tarot, as far as we know. And so it's described in a document in the 1500s. And so it just proves that, this pattern was known at that time. It's really interesting. Again, read the document by Thierry Depaulis, because it's really, really fascinating. And then last but not least, we have the Fool, which you have Le Faux in type 1, and then type 2 you have Le Mat. Now, this is only really applies to tarot before 1800, in the early part of tarot history. Because after that, you start getting different variations, and they mix them up a bit, and it's further along. But the early development of tarot, type 1 and type 2, is very, very useful. But that's all I wanted to show you. So this is what we mean by Tarot de Marseille. So technically, Tarot de Marseille is not from Marseille. If anywhere, it's from Lyon, in France. But so Tarot de Marseille is a misnomer, but it refers to the standard pattern, of which there are 2 types that existed early in France, in the 15, 16, 1700s. And so that's what Tarot de Marseille is, even in the 18th and 19th. In fact, there are probably still tarot being printed, and obviously it is, but the tradition continued for a really long time, and it didn't just exist in France either. There are Tarot de Marseille from all over Europe, Switzerland, everywhere. But anyway, I hope that was helpful for you in kind of understanding what Tarot de Marseille is. And, thanks for tuning in. Leave your comments below. And until next time, everyone, love and peace. Bye-bye.